I have recently joined FSD Kenya, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak today. I'm pleased to present the thinking behind our network strategy that brings together all the FSD entities in Kenya and has been developed in conjunction with CAF. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution of AFD and Proparco, who had commissioned me to do a large, deep dive into the Kenyan housing landscape last year, and allowed these learnings to be shared via a webinar, which is available on CAF's website. I want to start enthusiastically by reaffirming that Kenya has all the positives in place to enable a deep market transformation in affordable housing. We have deep demand, available land, building materials, developers with some experience, a priority government program with a strong regulatory framework, and deep capital markets. Yet we have a huge housing deficit that grows annually and are caught in what most funders call a chicken and egg cycle, where we deliver small projects slowly and at high cost. As a housing specialist, I take the above housing value chain for granted. Therefore, it has been really striking to hear from non-housing specialists over and over again in the past few months that the housing value chain is long and complex. It is precisely because of the length of this value chain and the multiple intersections at which good finance and good regulation are needed to support the delivery of housing that our focus for market transformation needs to shift away from unit delivery to transforming the ecosystem. We see that Kenya has 4 broad submarkets, which is generic of most of Africa. Kenya is more rural than its peers, with a greater rural population. Therefore, the incremental submarket is the biggest submarket with an estimated 9 million households. The other 3 categories are urban and include informal settlements at an estimated 1.6 million households, small landlords at 1.1 million households, and formal at approximately 360,000 households. We took a long time to look at all the interventions that have already been placed in Kenya, illustrated by value chain segment. We find that there is a focus again on the delivery of housing, as shown by all the interventions in the red circle, with less support than required on the rest of the value chain elements. Let's now look at each of the 4 submarkets and the learnings from some of the main interventions. We start with incremental housing, which we remember is extremely important as it serves approximately 9 million households. The failures, as we all know, are poor quality, long time to deliver, poor disjointed supply value chains, and poor land title rights for securitization. An interesting intervention is the Nyumba Smart program launched by KWFT with technical assistance from the Terwilliger Fund and MasterCard Foundation. The loan product is quite a success, having deployed up to 80 million in capital and providing approximately 80,000 different loan cycles with a reported repayment rate of up to 99% despite a high interest rate. KWFT uses the group microfinance model, and they have a vast branch network across Kenya to support their lending. The big opportunities to take this product further, which include evaluating the demand segmentation and preferences, linking with an online platform like iBuild to reduce leakage and promote efficiencies, and most importantly, providing value chain support for the house construction, including promoting effective technologies, faster plan approvals, etc. How this has comprehensively been done in Asian markets like Sri Lanka and India will be discussed by the EU delegate on Thursday. Next, we look at informal settlements, which serve an estimated 1.6 million households. Here, the key value chain failures are extremely poor quality. Unfortunately, Kenyan informal settlements have much poorer quality than other African cities. Contested land rights, and the fact that government and DFI initiatives to date have often led to displacement or taken very long to deliver. This table illustrates 5 key interventions, and it is unclear what the subsidy applied per unit is to enable further policy formulation. We look at 2 of these in more detail, which are literally adjacent to each other in Kibera. The railway housing is lauded for delivering up to 10,000 units with strong stakeholder engagement, compared to the Kensap housing, which resulted in displacement and has very few units. For both, however, the total subsidy is completely unclear. Given that the tenure in informal settlements is largely rental, we need to consider different approaches. The KISSIP program, for example, focuses more on delivery of bulk infrastructure rather than shelter, which is also desperately needed. We also need to think about promoting good rental housing instead of focusing on owner occupation, particularly as we have very limited subsidy. We must also integrate long-term management, as shown by the wear and tear and garbage accumulation in the relatively new railway project. The third submarket is small landlord, which serves an estimated 1.1 million households. This sector provides affordability in much better conditions than informal settlements, in relatively good locations, and at good yields for landlords. The picture in the middle shows a good, relatively small building, well located, providing a 9% net yield to its owner. However, the value chain failures are the small scale, lack of amenities provided, varying compliance, including provision of utilities. It is not uncommon to find the sewage of these units is simply disposed by calling an exhauster truck as and when required. And counties are not projecting or planning for the cumulative utilities needed to serve the housing units provided through this submarket. This sector already enjoys high access to finance currently, usually based on cash flows, but we were surprised to find that several lenders often do not pursue quality or compliance as part of their underwriting standards, as seen in the pictures on the right. The small landlord sector has been rightly recognized as having huge potential to promote affordability in the massive small movement. TUF in South Africa has pioneered several good practices of lending sustainably to this sector. In Kenya, we find a specific financing product for this sector, Makoa Poa loan by Leshego, with funding from the Microbuild Fund. The challenges Leshego faces are the currency risk, the high interest rate, and the short tenor. Indeed, the Microbuild Fund has only been able to deploy 9% of its capital in Africa compared to Asia and Latin America, really driven by the difficulties in finding suitable partners on the ground. The opportunities to expand this sector include providing technical assistance for building greener and more resilient housing, and integrating with tools for rental management and allowing tenants to build a credit history that can help them in future for their economic empowerment, not only to access credit for housing finance, but for other uses as well. We finally come to the smallest yet most studied and complex sector, the formal sector. The most striking insight we found through the AFD Proparco study was that hardly any developer in Kenya has delivered more than 1,000 units in its lifetime. The table here details all the developers studied from the private sector, public sector, SACCOs, local developers, developers with international backing, and we can clearly see that there's a disconnect with the current track record of relatively low delivery and the very ambitious delivery pipeline. This table captures the chicken and egg situation mentioned earlier, that funders are desperately looking for developers who have experience and skin in the game, yet the conditions to grow these developers is highly constrained. We'll now look at the value chain failures faced. When we look at the private sector and leading developers in the private sector in gaining scale, typical challenges quoted are access to infrastructure, access to construction financing, and offtake, emphasizing the need for a full value chain approach. On the SACCO side, NATU, a real partner, has delivered the most affordable units, but these are remote. Mwalimu Sacco's project, unfortunately, was very poorly targeted and poorly located, with only 20 of almost 900 units delivered being occupied almost a year after completion. Suraya's Nkasa project faces challenges in obtaining approvals from county government to tarmac its access road at its own expense. And such delays in approvals stigmatize the project and put it in distress. Greenspan is an example of an excellent, well-located mixed-use project, largely exited to mortgage buyers, but has delivered less than 100 units per annum. The key policy takeaway is that incentives provided to developers by government should be pegged to more realistic and smaller delivery numbers, as current incentives are hardly realistic or tappable. Another policy takeaway is the requirement for construction financing. Currently, developers offer steep discounts from 10 to 15 or even 20% for cash buyers over mortgage buyers, as alternative construction financing is very expensive, driven by the high interest rates offered by government on risk-free government paper. This puts the delivery risk on individual buyers who are least placed to mitigate the risk. We undertook a thorough search for the cheapest two-bedroom unit which can adequately fit a family across 8 neighborhoods in peri-urban Nairobi, and the results were really disappointing. We could not find one unit delivered by private sector that can meet the offtake price offered by government. We also find the yields for the owners of the units very low at less than 5%. And the resultant monthly mortgage over rent installment was very high at around 2.5. This ratio is becoming more competitive with the launch of KMRC, which is offering an almost 50% subsidy on interest. The challenges KMRC now faces are a lack of supply for product criteria. However, we hope the market will respond and provide the necessary product. The second policy question is what subsidy is being offered to the other 3 submarkets. Delivery on the public sector side is equally challenged. Prior to the launch of the Affordable Housing Program, the County Government of Nairobi and National Housing Corporation had delivered less than 300 units per annum since their inception. The expanded polystyrene factory of NHC, with which the Stony Athi units shown on these slides are delivered, do not seem to provide any affordability advantages to date. And the projects under the AHP are significantly also reliant on cash installments by buyers, as shown on this slide here. We can see, for example, the Pangani project is being funded by a 40% upfront deposit from a buyer, and then monthly installments in 36 installments. DFI investments have also had less impact than targeted. We looked at the impacts from the Pan-African Housing Fund, the African Development Bank, the IFC CITIC Partnership, Shelter Afrique, and Real, and we find the same issues that they all pose. In understanding the failures in the formal sector, we first need to acknowledge that the Kenyan market has enjoyed an incredible boom since 2003, and speculation played a big part in driving the boom. Therefore, the fundamentals of the sector have not had the chance to be aligned to sustainable growth. Anecdotally, 70% of formally supplied units are purchased by investors and therefore enter the rental market very ineffectively. The high costs are driven by construction costs, and as shown by CAF in the benchmark cost comparison across several countries in Africa, we see that Kenya is the most expensive in almost all the factor inputs. A significant portion is VAT, which is payable on all formal construction, but not necessarily captured on informal and small-scale construction. And we would advocate for significant or complete removal of VAT if we can prove the economic multiplier impact of doing this to government. Further, because land is so expensive and is amortized by higher building densities, so that the land contribution is capped at around 15% of the unit cost, formal developers have to bear the construction cost of building in apartments. This is clearly illustrated in this comparison of two very different developers in peri-urban Nairobi, where the small developer building single-story housing has almost half the input construction cost that a large developer building an apartment bears. It also speaks to the need to revisit single-story housing, perhaps on the thousands of subdivided plots sold by SACCOs, but still unserviced and undeveloped, as single-story housing development is very capital efficient. While the formal sector represents roughly 360,000 households, which is very small relative to the other submarkets, it is very important to address this sector. And that is what interventions like the AHP of the government and KMRC are trying to achieve. However, the benefits of these interventions can only be fully realized through openly acknowledging the delivery costs and timeframes and the realities of which demand segment is served. The investment will be transformative if the learnings are shared and used to empower change and scale, pushing the supply of formal down market and using the learnings to enable change in the small landlord sector to drive up compliance and standards. This slide, in a summary, lays out all the challenges that the government's program, which you could say was launched in some haste without adequate stakeholder engagement, has faced. But the key message is there's no silver bullet. There's no way to suddenly design programs that will overcome value chain barriers that have accumulated over decades of lack of attention. We can very quickly look at the demand side and see Kenya is more rural and that up to 75% of Kenyans can only afford a house of less than $10,000, which is the cheapest formally delivered house, typically a very small bedsit in a remote location. So what does the housing sector really need from finance? We need patient, blended finance products. We need these to work deeply with regulatory support. We need mechanisms for local currency capital. And we need to support market development and investment. By raising the bar on housing quality, being mindful of life cycle costs, providing the necessary incentives to invest in green features, enabling exits to local institutional capital, and promoting demand-side affordability. A quick calculation projecting Kenya's household need over the next 20 years shows that we currently have a deficit of 2 million units, and this deficit is growing by 350,000 units every year, resulting in a total deficit of 9 million units. The investment needed to fulfill this deficit is between $45 billion to $90 billion, depending on whether you assume that the average price of the house will be $5,000 or $10,000. This is beyond the capacity of any single investor or player, any group of investors or players. We need to come together and overcome our siloed competitive thinking and use the force of all stakeholders' capital and capacity to influence market transformation via collaboration. In closing, this is a representation of how collaboration between different groups of stakeholders can lead to transformation in the affordable housing delivery. FSD Kenya and the network invites you to join an affordable housing working group where we aim to bring together players in different roles, from investors, think tanks, research organizations, financial sector players, and local housing experts, to work together, and in doing so, step by step, begin to overcome the value chain failures currently faced in each submarket. We also make a big appeal for open source, as the IP is really in the delivery capability and not in accessing knowledge. A simple example is, we would like to fund the study of alternative building technologies to see what is practical and applicable to different markets, and would like to work with other players to share any information they've already done on this to date. And once complete, we would really like the study to be openly accessible by all players so that we're supporting the development and the supply chains for this selected technologies. Similarly, if developers were able to share their true costs, we can provide factual data to advocate for policy change to deliver housing more affordably. We look forward to working very closely with all the players in this room at this very exciting juncture in Kenya, which can also lead transformation regionally. Thank you.